It's been a long, strange trip for Dan Zakreski. The CBC Saskatoon reporter's career has seen times change from rotary dial phones to Reddit. And he's been hitting the streets in search of stories in Saskatchewan since 1981. First at the Star Phoenix and then here at the CBC. I'm Nicole Huck, and today on Blue Sky, we have a bittersweet show. After 45 years and more than 10,000 stories, Dan Zakreski, or Dan Zed as he's affectionately known around the newsroom, is retiring. Today is his last day, but before he goes, he's been kind enough to sit down with us to share some of the stories and the people that have stuck with him over the years. So if you have a message for Dan or a story of your own, you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. But if I were you, I'd just sit back, buckle up for a 45-year career in 50 minutes. We thought this was the right time for one final yarn spin from CBC's Dan Zakreski. He's with me in our Saskatoon studio. Dan, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, Nicole.
First off, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And how are you feeling today?
I didn't think anyone could be so happy and sad at the same time.
Yeah.
It's a mixed bag, that's for sure.
So just take us back. When did little Dan know he wanted to be a journalist?
You know, it wasn't a dream that I had since I was a child. I'd certainly been a writer ever since my earliest memories, taking notes, writing poems, writing stories. I was at the University of Regina in the 1970s, and I was doing an English degree. And I had gotten my BA in English and was working on an honors. And one of my honors professors was a guy named Warren Bennett. And he was doing a feasibility study for the School of Journalism and Communications, which they were going to be starting. And I was talking to him one day, and he said, Dan, what are your plans? And I said, well, I was thinking of going for an MA, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. I loved the university life. I liked arguing, and I liked writing. And he said, well, why don't you switch into this new journalism program? They're looking for mature students. They wanted people with degrees in that first class because they wanted everyone to stick it out. So I switched horses and went into it. And when I was in the program, the best thing they had was I had started in September of 1980. So I had 4 months at the journalism school. And then in January of 81, they sent me up here to Saskatoon on an internship at the Star Phoenix. So I went from the U of R to the rough and tumble of a big city newsroom.
Were you intimidated?
Oh, it was awful.
Yeah.
I walked in, and a couple of things right away. Everyone was older. They seemed, inexpressibly more experienced. You had people there who'd been reporters for like 5 years. But I was really taken aback at the overt hostility from so many of the people because I came from a university journalism program. And I was the first person there, to my knowledge, that had a journalism degree.
And they came from the School of Hard Knocks.
They came from the back shop and they came from the street. And they did not like me. And I had never been in a professional environment where I was not liked because of kind of what I represented. And I was not bringing anything that they could use. They had to teach me how to be a reporter. So it was a real overwhelming experience.
You wrote a really great final story that people can read on the CBC website. And in that, you reflect on how much things have changed and what hasn't changed over the last 45 years. But what would you say is, the biggest change in how journalism is done?
I think, and I was reflecting on that a little bit, technology has driven all the change, which is easy enough to say. We have social media, we have the internet, we have cell phones, we have laptop computers. But what that meant on a practical level for a young person in the 1980s starting as a reporter was if I wanted stories, I had to leave the office. I couldn't go onto a website or scroll social media. Our computers, we have a photo in the web story of me sitting at a desk writing at this suitcase-sized computer. Not only was it not attached to the internet, it was a local area network in our building. It didn't leave our building. So, short of getting a news release from the government or the city, if I wanted a story, I had to leave. I had to go meet people face to face. I had to go hunt stuff down. You would go to the library. You would use phone books. And that was the through line on everything. And I think the biggest change that I found with younger colleagues is a reliance on social media and computers.
Do you find yourself falling into that a little bit just because it is easier to pick up a phone or send an email?
No.
Never.
Well, no, not never.
Yeah.
I always used it for the tool that it was. I've talked to colleagues about this. They'll ask me sometimes, how did I get this story? Like a good example would be like a month ago. There was a horrible triple homicide up at Turtleford.
Yeah.
In a farmyard outside of town. I ended up, over time, getting an interview with one of the people directly involved. I interviewed her from jail. But my colleagues in the office were asking me, how did you get this? And I said, well, you saw me. You saw me get it. I sat at my desk and I started making phone calls. This was not one where I could leave the office and go track it down. So there is a chase component of what I do where you can use the technology. Calling up to Turtleford and Googling all the businesses and starting to phone businesses. Where did it happen? Where did it happen? Who are the people? Calling out to the First Nation. So it's sort of a mix. I love the technology, but I love getting out of the office more.
Yeah, and in that case, it's finding those voices that you wouldn't hear otherwise.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Speaking of voice, you estimate you've written more than 10,000 stories, which is a mind-boggling number, but you have a distinct voice and style. So how do you feel like you found your voice?
Early on when I was writing, two things. One, everything that I write, I read out loud to myself. So it has to pass the ear test. It has to read like a lyric. I have to hear my own voice. But the other was...
You say you read like a lyric, though. Are you thinking of that? Are you thinking about...
Yes, there's a rhythm. There's a pacing to it. I do not read my stories like this. I want them to flow. They speed up, they slow down, they're broken into chunks. You're hitting ideas. But in terms of the voice, I always, for a long time... the first person I ever wrote for in my mind was my Star Phoenix colleague, Les McPherson. He was my best friend at work, a terrific professional mentor. And I would write like I was talking to Les. So that would dictate the amount of background I would give, the type of language. It's not to sound stupid, but is this too big a word? Is this a word I would use with Les? Or is it a writing word? From Les, I transitioned to thinking of my brother and my uncle. I always had an idea in my mind of who am I telling this and what buttons am I trying to hit.
And why them? Are they a little bit more
Because they
critical?
were good friends. When I knew Les, we had a shared an early obsession with Elvis Presley, and we would read Elvis Presley books. So I sort of had a framework of pop culture references that I could use and the type of language and the importance of humor and pacing, and I admired his writing and his repertorial skills so much. Les and a good friend of mine, Terry Craig, who was a music writer. So between the two of them, I got a voice by thinking I was writing for a particular person.
You've been known for covering crime and the court beat. Not everybody wants to do that. What drew you to those stories and wanting to tell those stories?
I covered agriculture farming at the Star Phoenix. That was my last main beat, and I loved it. It was a spectacular beat. I went from there to general reporting, and I loved all of it. I liked the investigative aspect of it, the human interest, all of that stuff. But in the mid-1990s, I was in the Star Phoenix newsroom one day, and we got a call from the RCMP that a young woman's body, First Nations woman's body, had been found south of town off Highway 219, just on the way to Riverside Estates. And the RCMP had invited all the reporters out there for a show and tell. They wanted to get to the bottom of this. It was a young woman who was found there, frozen to death, no shoes, and she had overdosed. So I went out there, and it was horrifying and fascinating at the same time. Like, it was sort of, and this says more about me than anything else, but it spoke to my fascination with police. Like, there was police tape there were figures of authority, there was a body, and something bad had happened. I sort of didn't know what I didn't know, and I look back on it, and people really didn't do this, but I started to phone around, and I found the name of the victim, and then I found her family. and I ended up calling this, her name was Tammy Lee Pickett. I'll always remember her. She had overdosed at a party in Saskatoon, and rather than call the authorities, they'd taken her body outside of town and dumped her. And I talked to her mom, and her mom had said to me that she didn't want to die without knowing what had happened to her little girl. And when she told me that, I thought, oh my God, how could I cover anything except this stuff? The gift that she had given to me of sharing her daughter's story and the trust that she showed. And it just struck me as so important that somebody had to give a voice to this young woman who couldn't talk about what happened at the party. Oh, we had lots of stories about the guy and the hood and all of that stuff and drugs and blah, blah, blah. What about her? And once I did that, I thought, I can't go back to covering farm stories. I can't go back to council meetings and committees. These are people in my community. And that was the first one, and that was the one that has defined everything. I used to say I was speaker for the dead. Somebody had to give voice to these people.
I imagine you've met a lot of families that are grateful that their loved one isn't defined by their death, but is potentially defined, or at least people get to know a little bit about the person that they were because of the storytelling that you do.
I've tried that. Yes, in the best scenarios, it's such a mixed feeling because so many of these people I still have relationships with, and I will run into them, and it's always the same thing. They look at me, and there's that moment of, oh God, this is the guy he is the living reminder of the worst day of our life. And at the same time, this is the guy that stood up for our loved one and gave voice to them. It wasn't just somebody that died of a drug overdose or was murdered. They had a family and loved one and life circumstances. Boy, as I got into it, I found the world is so much grayer than I thought it was when I started.
Dan, you can easily fill a whole hour, but there are a lot of other voices from your past and people who want to join the conversation today. So the first voice we're bringing in is somebody who sat beside you for years. Brittany Zapshella is on the line now. Brittany, welcome to Blue
Dan.
Sky.
Britt!
Hi.
I was afraid you'd be calling in.
Dun, dun, dun. This is your life.
And just so listeners know, we didn't tell Dan anything about today's show, about anybody who he might hear from or anything we were going to talk about. So this is just Dan, shooting from the hip as he does. But Brittany, what was your first introduction to Dan Zakreski?
Well, my first introduction to him was actually by reputation because he came to talk to our J School class in 1999. And, I was not the kind of young aspiring reporter that wanted to tell the hard stories. I liked the easy ones. I liked the features, the art stories, the live events. So when I met him, I was really actually intimidated because this is the guy that covered, the Starlight Tours, the wrongful conviction of David Milgaard. And here I was meeting him, and I was hoping that he wouldn't discover or figure out that I really wasn't the kind of reporter that most people were aiming to be in J School.
So I understand you have a story from your time with Dan, from a story back from 2006.
Yeah,
Take us back to 2006.
Well, it's a big crime thriller, really. In July 2006, Curtis Dagenet shot and killed 2 RCMP officers and injured another person near Spiritwood after a standoff. And, we were only days into the manhunt for Kurt Dagenet. He was on the run, and there were police everywhere. The town was on edge. There were posters everywhere. They knew what Kurt looked like. And Dan was going to try and find out who this guy was and try to figure out why he might have done this. So I came in the day, that one day in July, and you never know what's going to happen in the newsroom. But Dan had gotten a hold of Kurt's uncle, Herb Jaster, and somehow convinced him to talk to us. But he had to do it out in his field near his farmyard, and Dan needed a camera person to go along with him. So there were no camera people to be had, and I was just a new videographer, and so I was convinced to come along for the ride.
You know what?
So,
we actually have a little bit of tape. This before Dan comes in with his version of the story. I want to play this clip from our colleague Jenna Leith went through the archives. She found some of the tape from some of these interviews that are some of the big stories over the last 40 years, and we'll play that right now.
Herb Jaster isn't supposed to be driving these back roads, not since the RCMP launched a massive manhunt for his nephew. Kurt Dagenet is accused of shooting 2 RCMP officers only a few miles from here. Jaster says his sister Elsie's bitter divorce from Art Dagenet triggered the violent confrontation with the 2 officers 6 days ago.
What happened on Friday that led to Kurt Dagenet being accused of these shootings?
My sister and her ex-husband had a court appearance in Battleford, and they were going to divide the property up, and it was just him and his lawyer and the judge and Elsie and her lawyer, and Art says she's not getting anything, and anyway, of course, he became aware that the law is a law. He has to sacrifice half of what they have, and he came home apparently and got a hold of Kurt and told Kurt that you're going to lose half the farm, that Kurt was supposed to inherit the farm. And he knew darn well that Kurt would fly off the handle.
How did you react when you found out what had happened?
Not a bit. I didn't react a bit because we were anticipating that. It was a matter of time that somebody was going to get shot. Everybody said that. Art don't like losing, and Kurt, he's got a chip on his shoulder and on drugs and everything, and it was a matter of time, and there was going to be shooting. We expected that.
Was this sort of event in character for Kurt?
Definitely, yeah. He's always in trouble. If I shot and killed him, I'd feel about as much remorse as if I shot a mangy coyote. Because he's tortured our family for years, and I have no respect for him. And I have no respect for his dad. And the whole community would be behind me.
Again, that's pretty strong words.
It is. I call it as I see it.
Calls it as easy as it. Dan, what do you remember from that story?
Oh boy. Over the years, I've gone out in the field with so many young reporters, and it's like the luck of the draw. Sometimes they fold like card tables. They just do. Like, that's where you find out if you get, people that like that sort of thing, this is the sort of thing you like. And I went out there with Brittany, who I barely knew. She was she looked 12.
She still does.
Yeah, she was in her 20s. But we got out there, and the things I remember, first of all, was she shot like a pro. Like, that's a beautifully shot piece. And she had no fear. I was standing next to her, and I grew about 10 feet because I thought, okay, I'm out here with I got a baby wolf with me, so I'd better not drop my end. And I remember that mangy coyote quote. But standing in that field with Britt, because Kurt was still on the run at that time. And I thought, my young colleague here, she's not scared. Like, this is awesome. I love this. It was everything I loved about the job with someone that I had never met before, really, in the field.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brittany, I appreciate you bringing that memory up. Final words to Dan?
Yeah, Dan, you've taught me so much, and we've had so many laughs in the office and in the time since then. And just thanks for being a great storyteller and really telling us what we should know and making us laugh the whole time. Really appreciate it. Good luck in your retirement, buddy.
Thanks, Britt.
That's Brittany Zabshela, former CBC reporter. Dan, one of the things that you're known for is going the extra mile to get the story. And I want to talk about some of your methods. So we're going to go back, hear another little clip here, and then you can tell us about what we're hearing.
Sure.
You fucking rat. Bang! Fuck. And I grabbed the guy. And I'd already been shot in the face, and we went this way and then over here, and he kept shooting me as we fell into the corner here. He was saying, you got the wrong guy, man. You got the wrong guy.
Okay, what were we listening to there? I had to use two beeps for preparation for this show.
Kelly Hansen, the indestructible Kelly Hansen. This was back in the early 2000s. I was covering court and came out of a weekend, and there'd been a melee, as we say in the business. A guy had been shot. The news release from the police, this guy had been shot 5 times and lived, and all sorts of bad things had happened all over the city. So I went to provincial court because I was at that point the savvy veteran. I knew that they had somebody charged. And I got the court documents, and the court documents had the complainant's name on it, i.e. the guy that had been shot, Kelly Hansen. So I got on the phone and phoned Royal University Hospital and bluffed my way through to a nurse's station. Are you a family member?
Yeah.
So they put me through, and I found out he was at RUH. So I drove over and got there. And I remember going up to the ward, and as I approached the nurse's station, I could hear yelling in the background. And I'm going, I'm looking for a guy named Kelly Hansen. Oh, you can hear him. That's the guy over there. And I go, well, I'm a reporter with CBC, and I'd like to talk to him. And they go, he's all yours. So this guy comes over dressed in his robe, like you saw in the photos.
Yeah,
he had like
he's
been shot
his...
in the face and the arm and everything. And I said, I'm a reporter. I'd like to do a story with you. And he says, well, I just want to get out of here. And I looked at the nurses, and they say, well, if you can get out of here, you can get out of here. And then he said, well, I don't have a car. And I said, I do.
Okay, Dan, right now I'm going to pick up that story. We got one more clip from Kelly Hansen himself.
I was at home with my girlfriend laying in the garage watching a little television, and there was a knock on the garage door. I asked who it was, and it said me, and I know lots of friends, so I opened the door to get I believe it was a 38 in the face. And the guy yelled, "You're dead, you rat," and I grabbed him, and he continued shooting my arms and until he was out of bullets, and I kept talking to him, and he realized that he didn't have the right guy.
So how did he go? You went from a hospital bed to getting this interview with a guy at his house.
This speaks to the completeness of my CBC experience, because when I worked at the Star Phoenix, I was on my own. I was the lone wolf, Nicole.
Yeah.
I would go out with my notebook and
You're
my pen.
still a bit of a lone wolf.
Still a bit of a loner, but I worked for a team. And I phoned back to the CBC newsroom, and I said, I need a camera now at RUH, because I knew we were going to drive this guy back to his house. So Art Martin came out, and I have had the benefit over the years at CBC, 20 plus years, to a person working with the best camera people in the business. Art came and got us at the hospital, didn't even blink. I pick up a bloody guy in his bathrobe, and we drive him right to his house. And the first thing that Art did, this guy was obsessed with, he wanted Schwishers, cigars. So Art looks at me and he goes, "Go get him his cigars." Art, it is I, Dan Zakreski. I have to do this interview. And Art said, "Go get him the cigars." So I hop in the van and go get the cigars, and I come back and Art's packing his gear up. And what he had done was he knew that I had to be off-site so that he could get Kelly to act out what had happened without him looking at me. So I came back to the newsroom, and every reporter should have one of those experiences where Art goes, "Look what I got." And he sticks the tape in the case, and there's Kelly opening the door. Rat, blam, blam. It was astonishing. And it was because I worked with someone like Brittany who knew exactly what they were doing, and it elevated everything. And that was the best thing about being a CBC reporter, was that the team part of it.
Right now, you're listening to Blue Sky on CBC Radio. You're hearing the voice of Dan Zakreski, a voice very familiar to people all across this province. We're celebrating the 45-year career of Saskatoon reporter Dan Zakreski. He's a larger-than-life personality who's worked on some of the biggest stories of the past 4 decades in this province. And today he's reflecting back on the lessons he's learned and the people in this province who have become part of his DNA. If you have a message for Dan, you can email bluesky@cbc.ca, and we'll make sure we pass it along to him. We've got an email here from David Kyle. He says, I was at CBC Saskatchewan when Dan was still reporting for the Star Phoenix. One day I said, I think I'm tired of us always chasing those Zakreski stories, and darn it, they were good. That set the ball rolling, and when the planets and journalistic gods lined up, Dan crossed the street to the Saskatoon CBC Bureau and never looked back. At least that's how I remember it. Congratulations, Dan, on your retirement and great career in both print and broadcast. Thanks for all the great journalism. And that's from David Kyle, former executive producer and bureau chief and regional director of CBC Saskatchewan.
Incidentally, David Kyle and I, along with Marlon Marshall, were all in the first graduating class from the U of R. So Marlon went to the leader post and went on to become the managing editor. I stayed at the Star Phoenix and became the leg breaker that I went on to become. And David became executive director. So it was my former college classmate who reached out and hired me at CBC.
81 was a good year.
Yeah, that was a very good year. And David was a great boss.
Dan, before you weren't always a crime reporter. You started in 1981 at the Star Phoenix, as you've said. One of those people that knows you from that time is now managing editor at the CBC News in Quebec. So once upon a time, you were seatmates. And Kim McNairn, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hello. Hey, Dan.
Kim.
So Kim, Dan's retiring today. What are you thinking?
I was listening to Dan a few minutes ago talk about getting out, knocking on doors, going to the library, looking at the phone book. And I know that's what I remember when I joined the Star Phoenix. It's like an intern in 1997 from the U of R, and meeting Dan. And he just it was so inspiring that he was just so curious and just had all these different ways of just working a story. And that's how I learned to go to the local history room at the downtown library and look things up. And it made you kind of fearless to just go to court and go to City Hall and just ask questions. Like, that's the job. So I feel like that was for me. I'm in journalism and now leading a newsroom, and I'm having those same conversations with people of just go talk to people. And because I really learned from sitting beside Dan and watching him work every day is that that is the work, and it can be fun, and it can keep you curious. So I just want to say, Dan, that time with you early on in my career really helped me be really passionate about the work I do. And now I'm working with other people to do that same kind of work. So I just wanted to be here today to congratulate you and say that it's been so important to so many of us journalists down the line.
What was the newsroom like in that era? And take us back to the Saskatoon Star Phoenix. It's a very different experience for journalists now who might be just writing at home. What was the Saskatoon Star Phoenix like in the 80s?
If you're asking me,
yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, it was fascinating, especially with Kim there, because she would have been generationally not far behind me. I think we have probably a significant age gap chronologically, but professionally we weren't that far apart. So when Kim was in the newsroom, I would have been in my mid-30s, and at that point, mid to late 30s, at that point, the newsroom was my entire social world. My wife and I socialized with everyone in the office. That was our larger community. We had to have house parties. We would go out on the town together. People in the newsroom would be dating each other. I was there when Kim met her current husband.
It was before HR departments and whatnot. Yeah.
Who sat right next to me. So it was a fascinating time because on one hand, you would have all of these social relationships with people, and people, when they're socializing, are different when they are at work. So you would get a perception of people when you were with them at a party or out drinking at the bar. But like Brittany Zapshala Robinson or like Kim, when I would get to work and I would look over and see how Kim would be working on a story and the stuff that she did, it was phenomenal because it was like, oh yeah, these are my people, not just socially, but also professionally. So yeah, it was a different world. I mean, everything from people, still smoking in the newsroom, the dating, the casual racism and misogyny.
I'm glad some things have changed.
Yes. Yeah. It was really an astonishing place. So it was the 80s, and it was pre-social media. So we were doing stuff that wasn't going to end up posted on a social website. We have stories that I'm so glad that nobody took pictures of. I'll just leave that one there.
I'm like, my mind is going a lot of places, and it's probably for the benefit of our corporation. We should probably not go too deep into some of those stories, but if there was one quality, you said, Kim, that you're running a newsroom now. If there's one quality from Dan the journalist that you'd like to clone for your staff, what would it be?
I think it's the curiosity about your community and the people in it. And Dan, you heard those clips of people you're talking to. Like, you're curious about everyone in the community. You treat them with respect. You want to know their story. And just going with that approach helps you like drive that fearlessness, and that just like, this is such a privilege to be able to just talk to people and be curious about their story and their life, no matter it's the best day of their life or the worst day of their life. And I also appreciated that this idea of knowing your community and being part of it. That I remember coming in and Dan was the agriculture reporter, and then he was the crime reporter at Provincial Court. I was like, wow, you can be curious about all parts of your community, and you become an expert in it. And I just like how I always try and that is what makes a great journalist, is someone who's curious, who cares, who wants to find out more, and is just going to dig and realize that is an important role in our community. And I just saw Dan do that from so many different perspectives. And being someone who's a younger journalist at the time and watching the impact of his stories and following them was like, wow, like the work that you're doing has impact and it has change. So that's really inspirational. And I think for like all journalists, like that's really how you can make change in your communities is what matters.
Kim, I appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks.
Dan, is there anything else you wanted to, I'm sorry, I'm manipulating.
No, that's fine. Thanks so much, Kim. It was great.
Yeah.
It was. I've watched your career with great interest, and always knew that you would end up running a newsroom. You had always had that. You were a great reporter, but you were more of a leader than I think I ever gave you credit for to your face. So I've always been really proud of how it worked out for you.
Thank you so much, Dan. That's very sweet, and best of luck.
Thank you.
That's Kim McNair, she's a managing editor for the CBC News in Quebec. And, speaking of impact, we have another voice from that era in your career, Dan. So if we want to go back to the year 2000, actually, and another story that shook the province. January 26 years ago, the bodies of 2 First Nations men were found frozen in a remote area of Saskatoon. It was a place where nobody walked, especially in the winter. And then a man named Daryl Knight came forward and said he'd been dropped off by police on the outskirts of town, but he'd made it back alive. So Saskatoon Star Phoenix reporters Les Perot and our Dan Zakreski did stories on these so-called Starlight Tours, shone a light on the systemic racism in the Saskatoon police force. Les Perot went on to be a national correspondent for the Globe and Mail. He's now the editor-in-chief of Policy Options, and he's on the line now. Hey, Les, welcome to Blue Sky.
Nice to join you.
So I don't know if you were listening earlier, but Dan was talking about, he was talking about you earlier as the person that he would have in his mind when he was writing a story.
That's Les McPherson.
Well,
that's
Les
actually
McPherson.
a different Les. Yeah, we had 2 Leses for quite a while.
Les was who I had in my mind when I went fishing.
Okay,
apologies for that.
Also old fishing buddies. So before we talk about Starlight Tours, though, I have to go back and talk about something that Dan mentioned earlier. So he spoke with great enthusiasm about his time as an agriculture reporter. Mm-hmm. And this is very important to me because my career as a journalist and my first time meeting Dan, my time starting at the Star Phoenix, was when Dan was the agriculture reporter. And it was a time before the Star Phoenix started going through rounds of cutbacks and that sort of thing. So it had enough people around to have things like an agriculture reporter. And my lasting memory of my very first weeks with Dan was, somebody gets paid to do that? Because I made a joke to Kim earlier. By the way, I'm the husband of the previous, more successful journalist guest that Dan had mentioned. In some ways, I was joking with Kim earlier that this is actually Dan's second retirement, because when I saw him as the agriculture reporter back in the day, he worked a very nice schedule with very nice hours, and I often wondered, how does he get away with this? So to fast forward, though, and I was glad that Dan talked about his transition, because honestly, it's one of the most inspirational things I've ever seen, not just in journalism, but in working life. Because Dan went from a guy who sort of had his spot in the newsroom, was a senior guy, could sort of pick what he got to do, wrote lots of movie reviews, as I recall, back in that era as well. And reinvented himself completely. I think in your mid-30s, Dan, probably at the time.
Yeah, that'd be about right. Yep.
And as Brittany and others have mentioned, reinvented himself in one of the hardest things to do in journalism. It wasn't just phoning around to the elevators to find out how much grain's moving or following livestock prices. It's going out in often scary situations to talk to people who you don't know how they're going to react when they encounter you. And I think that, for me, is the thing that I will always take away from Dan's working life, that he knocked himself out of what was a pretty cushy situation to become the legend that has led to all of this now, and the career that has been 30 of the 45 years he's been working.
Dan, you talked about some of the, it's the people, right? It's the people and your desire to tell their stories that really got you down that path. And take us back to the year 2000. I mean, the Starlight Tours story, it shook the province. And the ripples are still being felt, I would say, today even. How did you get on that story?
Yeah, It started off as a cautionary tale. I mean, there were sort of two stories that were happening at the same time. One, we had a couple of deaths would be characterized as death by misadventure. They turned up as police news releases. As was often the case, two people found frozen to death. And it just sounded like they had, been at a party or whatever. And we didn't really know the circumstances. They weren't named or anything. But at the same time, my city editor at the time, Gord Struthers, had gotten a tip, an incredibly improbable tip that Saskatoon police had dropped some people off at the edge of town. So I hadn't made the connection in my mind between the two. So I started off by doing what I thought was going to be sort of a news you can use feature on one of the guys that had frozen to death, kind of and not to sound glib, but a best practices for the winter in Saskatchewan. Don't get drunk and go out without a jacket at 40 below because you can die. This happened to this guy. So I called the police and just wanted some basic information on who the victim was. And they wouldn't tell me the name, but the police communications officer did me a great solid and said, you might want to check the North Battleford obits. And lo and behold, I found an obituary for a guy named Lawrence Wagner. And I found out who he was and where he lived. And over the course of about a week, started to develop a feature on this guy. I wanted to tell the story on the guy who was going to the Indian Federated College and was a student but had some drug issues and had gotten himself into a set of circumstances that particular evening where he ended up freezing to death out at the landfill. We had no idea how he got out there, but that was kind of what I was working on. At the same time, I was continuing to pursue with the police this improbable rumor that they had actually dropped some people off. And when I would approach them, the police communications guy would say, well, we can't give an answer right now. We aren't going to give you an answer right now. Just hold off. And I'm going, well, I'm just waiting for the categorical blow-off here. Just tell me you didn't do it and I'll go for coffee and I'll get back to my feature. The third leg in this, well, the third and fourth leg, the third was when I started doing the math, I realized that Lawrence Wagner, he was found on a Tuesday out at the landfill, had actually last been seen the previous Thursday. And that same weekend, another dead guy had been found frozen out near the landfill, a guy named Rodney Nastus. So suddenly I had two guys frozen out at the landfill on the same weekend. I had police not giving me much background on what had actually happened. Like, they wouldn't deny the drop-offs. They kept putting me off. Finally, with the door knocking, I thought, well, at some point I have to sort of try to reconstruct Lawrence Wagner's evening. So I had interviewed his roommate, found out where they were, and I went out to 20th Street by St. Paul's Hospital. And I was door knocking, and I had an experience that I would, as horrible as it was, I would hope that every reporter would have a moment like this, where I knocked on a door and the woman answered, and I said, I'm trying to do a story on this Lawrence Wagner. And she goes, oh, that's my cousin's son. And I go, oh. And she goes, yeah, that night he came pounding on my front door. We answered the door and he was yelling, pizza, pizza. And we opened it and he was in his T-shirt and jeans and socks, 40 below. And she thought, holy smokes, this is wrong. So he took off and she thought, well, we should phone the police. So she phoned the police and she told me that she had phoned the police and they had said somebody had already called 911 about him. So at that moment...
She called the police because she was concerned about him?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So at that point, I had the intersection between the guy frozen out at the dump and the police had been called about him. And then when the police finally did come through, I pestered them enough. I went to meet with them. They had told me, as a matter of fact, that same weekend, 2 officers were under investigation for having dropped off a third man, Daryl Knight, who didn't die. And that's where all of these different elements came together into one massive, explosive story. I still can't believe it when I tell it.
I feel things sick to my stomach.
Well, sick, but yeah. It's awful. But journalistically, to be caught up in something like that and to have the pieces come together.
How did that feel at that moment when you I guess kind of assembled it all?
I was terrified by how excited I was about it. I couldn't believe that we had it on the record. I remember there was a famous lawyer in town named Silas Halleck, a defense lawyer, and I ran into him about 3 days before we ran the story, and he wanted to know kind of what was going on, and I said I was working on this story, and he goes, he says, I was at the police station and they're losing their minds there. Something is really bad is happening. So it was awful. And when we got into it, I had always heard, I knew that, because I had covered court for so long, First Nations relations in the city were not great. You'd always heard stories about racism and how police treated people and such, and you never really believed it. Well, I believed it after that. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of a sudden, all the stories that came out of First Nations relations with police, it really ripped the Band-Aid off a real ugly part of this city's history. And I think brought about a reckoning that was a long time coming.
Les, we have Les Perot on the line right now too, and Les, some of your reporting, complemented each other's. When did you realize that this was a pattern of behavior for the Saskatoon police?
Well, as you can imagine, inside the newsroom, we were all walking around in about the same state as Dan, a mixture of excitement and just not believing what was going on. And from my end, I just tried to think of a way I could be useful and helpful as Dan was leading this investigation. And so I went to the newspaper morgue. In the old days, they used to keep clippings of all our stories. And I just looked up there was an actual folder of stories about people found dead outside. And started flipping through it. And they were all just little briefs, and none of them seemed particularly relevant. And then I stumbled across a story about Neil Stonechild and his mother basically raising concerns about how her son had come to be dead in a field on the north end of town, in this case, not at the dump, but and it just hit me like a bag of hammers. That this seemed quite evidently a possible connected story. And then, we chased it down, found a witness who said he'd been taken away by police. I called his mother. she picked up the phone and said, "I've been waiting for you to call," essentially, because she'd been heard about what had been going on. And I guess she figured we'd connect the dots eventually, or maybe someone in Saskatoon had given her a call. But so that was my small contribution on a very important part of the story, I guess.
And what changes did this story result in? I mean, ultimately, it's about having made a big impact with this story.
Yeah, I'm not going to let Les minimize what he did here. This was everything I liked about newsrooms and working with reporters like Les and Kim, who were a generation behind me. Everyone wanted a piece of that story. Les Perot went back through 10 years worth of stories. This wasn't there was no Google search. He was the human Google, and he tracked this down. And as interesting, as important as the stories that I had done on Lawrence Wagner and Rodney Naistus and Daryl Knight, it was Les's work with Neil Stonechild a decade earlier, where a family had been blown off, and the passion of Neil's mom and family, Stella Bignell, that led to the commission of inquiry into the death of Neil Stonechild. They had coroner's inquests into Wagner and Naistus and such. No, it was the inquiry that led to the investigation into systemic racism, and that reached its conclusions about what the Saskatoon Police Force had been doing for more than a decade, not just a bad weekend. So that's what that was.
We're quickly coming up to the end of the show, and I mean, we could do an entire day for sure. But I want to read an email just to both of you from Danella Hoffman, Star Phoenix from 1990 to 2005. Writes, "Huge congratulations on your retirement, Dan. Happy to say I knew you when back in the newsroom at the Star Phoenix. What a loss when you left us. You sharing these memories is an invaluable glimpse into how a great journalist does their work and makes their community a better place. The works by you and the other great reporters on the Starlight Tours story was a turning point for Saskatoon and our province. We're indebted. Enjoy the years ahead." So, Les, I want to thank you for joining our conversation today. I know that, again, I feel like we just don't have enough time for all of it, but I appreciate you sharing that perspective. And as it's January and we're, just thinking back on what it would have been like to be pushing against, especially when the police at that time were accusing you of wanting to start a race war. It took guts.
That's a fight we were going to pick.
Yeah. So thank you for that. It's 12:56. There's only minutes left. Dan, there's so much more that I wanted to talk to you about, but I do want to give you an opportunity to. I know that the stories are ultimately about people and connections you've made. Is there a person? I know there's pages and pages of people, but is there someone who really stuck with you because of the stories that you've told?
Well, my wife.
Yeah.
She had to live through this. Audrey Veroni, 45 years of me coming home with this stuff.
Yeah.
And she had to deal with that. I was not always the best person to live with going through this. The number of times she had to tap me out when we were talking because the stuff that I was doing just didn't fly. I couldn't do it without having somebody in my life like that to balance it. As a more general observation, I just want to thank anyone that ever trusted me with their story. That was a gift and privilege for me. These are people that will stay with me forever. And there's too many. I can't start naming them.
You can't. And
I can't, and I don't want to.
We know that there will be, that there's a next chapter for Dan Zakreski for sure, whether that's a podcast, book, live action, musical. Dan, thank you for everything that you've done. We really appreciate that. That's Dan Zakreski signing off from 45 years as a reporter here in Saskatoon. I'd like to thank the people that put the show together this week. Producer Joelle Seal, technician Camille Bolin, Jenna Leith combed through the archives and found all these great stories of Dan's career. On Monday, we're taking a look at the state of emergency rooms and urgent care centers in this province. We'll hear from frontline workers about what they're seeing. We'll talk to healthcare professionals about how to prevent people from ending up in those, and we want to hear about your recent experiences in our province's emergency rooms. So you can email us right now, bluesky@cbc.ca. Take care of each other. Go read Dan's story on the CBC Saskatchewan webpage.